because I think you'd probably really rather hear more from Mike Ford than listen to a teacher. Certainly my students would agree with that. So in that sense, I apologize, but it's wonderful to be here. And I thank Canada's History for the opportunity to speak. It was a rare privilege last year to get the Governor General's Award. It's a very stirring, very emotional experience. And congratulations to this year's winners. They'll feel much the same as I did last year. Very, very, very honored. So I want to talk to you today about storytelling from a history teacher's perspective. And again, I'll apologize just because I do use some edu jargon in my presentation. And for the teachers in the audience, you'll sort of perk up or perk down depending upon whether you appreciate this or not. But it does, going through what I'm going to go through does require a little bit of edu jargon. So I'll start, and I have about 15 minutes, and I'll try to do it in about 12 if possible. I like to think that storytelling is the gateway drug of studying high school history. Once you've tried it, you have to try the next intoxicant, and then the next one, and then the next one, until you're finally hooked. And though the metaphor ends there, my point is simple. I want kids to become addicted to history. Rich, well-embroidered, layered, and textured storytelling is still the best means of getting kids hooked on history. I tell them in class that there's no rehab for it, and nor should there be. You should be addicted for life. In my 28 years of teaching in the classroom, my classroom has gone through all kinds of upheaval and changes. Certainly that's been the experience in Ontario, and I suspect it's been the case across the country. My classroom has become differentiated. It's become demonstration-based. And now in the last few years, it's become digital. But through it all, there's been one constant, and that's been the struggle to tell good stories and do good storytelling in the classroom. Now, people like Mike Ford and Nancy Payne on this platform today are far better equipped than I am to tell you the stories of Canadian history. My intention today instead is to talk to you a little bit about some quiet corners of history teaching that have shown success in taking students on a journey to discovery in Canadian history. And I want to start by saying there is no private alchemy to this. There are no great secrets to successful storytelling and history teaching. But I have found in my experience 4 important considerations if one's goal is to teach good storytelling. The first is what I call conceptual framing. What that really means in non-edu speak is that there are some historical thinking concepts that every student from an academic point of view who's studying history has to grapple with and eventually master. The second is what Mark spoke about this morning, and that's contextual authenticity, although he didn't use that term. He said it much better than that. And that's about getting the kids out of the classroom and taking them to the places where history actually happened. The third is student-driven learning, and really that's just as it suggests. It's about putting the student in the driver's seat of their own learning in history and giving them some control over the mastery of it. And finally, maybe the most controversial one is making historical judgments. And this is about putting students in the position of having to make ethical choices and eventually make ethical decisions in everything that they learn in the history class. I think these 4 are, if there are secrets, these 4 are the secrets to successful storytelling in history class at a high school level. And certainly with the young students that we saw this morning, I could see it burgeoning in them right there. They were doing it as we watched them. That was wonderful to see. I am so lucky. I have the best local museum in Canada in my own backyard. It's a wonderful place. It's called the Dufferin County Museum and Archives. I have partnered with this place over the last 25 years, and the museum has become my students' second classroom. It's richly textured with hundreds of exhibition items, both small and large. The museum is a perfect place for history teachers to teach good storytelling to students. And yet, we know so few students go to their local museums across Canada. And when they do go, in many cases what they do is so sterile and silly that it has, relatively speaking, no meaning. And that's a challenge for us, is to make those engagements at the museums much richer. The essential starting point for good storytelling and history teaching should be students making presentations and students doing primary resource research. All of that is essential to good storytelling, as is good teaching. But whatever you do, it should be, in all cases, purposeful, it should be intentional, and it should be meaningful in everything that a student does. And that's sort of the starting point from it. Let me give you 3 examples. I often will ask students to tell me the historical significance of certain artifacts by imagining a story about each one, whether it's a dentist chair from the 1900s, the early 1900s, or whether it's a wonderful woven casket that they had to use in Dufferin County in the marsh area to bury people. It kind of creeps the kids out to think about that, but it actually had to happen. Or is it the console used by the Shelburne Telephone Company up until the 1970s? Tell me a story about that in about 3 minutes. Next, to get to those historical thinking concepts, I'll ask the students to explain to me change over time. Explain to me the change over time in about a 3-minute story of a certain location in Dufferin County. In this case, I picked Rock Hill Park, which in the 1960s was quite a location for rock and roll concerts. And by 1973, it was a huge venue in southern Ontario for outdoor concerts, and yet by 2014, this is what it looks like. You know, there's a very rich story that students can engage in and tell me what happened. Third example I'll give you is taking an item such as this, which is an ordinary item that we might use in the history class on a regular basis, and ask the student to give me the 2 competing perspectives about its importance. And of course, that's easy to do in the history class. It's easy to get kids to tell you that. But what all these examples do is they encourage students to think historically, while at the same time provoking an imaginative process that all too often history teachers squelch in their pursuit of covering content. Now, don't get me wrong. Content coverage is fundamental to teaching good history. But all too often, the strictures of provincial curricula strangle creative historical pursuit. Let me say that one more time, like I do for my class. All too often, strictures of provincial curricula strangle creative historical pursuit. And that's a problem for us. As our good friend Mark Twain said, we can bring Mark Twain in today, never let the truth get in the way of telling a good story. I would not connect that to Pierre Burton, but I would suggest that good storytelling often requires embroidery. Academics in the room, of course, may suffer paralysis at the suggestion that a history teacher would be doing this with their students. But the challenge is, if we hope to keep a fluid and accessible Canadian narrative for our future historians, they better learn to have fun with the stories. The second fundamental foundation for teaching good storytelling in history class is contextual authenticity. And again, I'm so pleased that Mark spoke about this morning. My colleagues and I often debate what is the weakest skill that students demonstrate in their historical analysis. And for my money, it is grasping the context of history. It is so subtle a skill and requires so much depth on the part of the storyteller. Key to it, though, is getting the kids out of the classroom and into the authentic historical environments which stimulate imagination. So often cost becomes the great determinant as to whether this can be accomplished. Busing, administration, admission to venues, insurance coverage, flight, tickets for flights. The list goes on for teachers. However, history teachers can ill afford to ignore this component if we wish to create the next great Canadian storyteller. Whether it is as ambitious as going to the beaches of Normandy, which I have done 10 times with history classes full of students, to the Juno Beach Center, the beautiful facility on the beaches of Normandy, to tell the stories of World War II veterans in situ, or to go to Vimy, to honor the veterans who are listed on the monument there, to have your picture taken at that most important pivotal place in Canadian history, or as in this small slide here, to go back to Juno Beach once you've been to Vimy and to tell the stories of World War II veterans, having seen the World War I veteran stories. Or commemorating at the Menin Gate. Last week we saw this magnificent celebration of the 100th anniversary of the start of the Battle of Ypres. And the Menin Gate, of course, is such a stirring place to attend in Ypres at any time of the year. Or taking students to Amsterdam and having them tell the story of a Dutch-Canadian resistance fighter, again, in situ in Amsterdam. All of these are remarkably powerful examples of contextual authenticity. But if you can't take students, then at least do this. Bring the seniors into the students' world and have the students learn the personal and intimate stories of Dufferin County seniors, the wealth of experiences they've had growing up and living through the 20th century and in many cases into the 21st century. And if you can't do that, then at the very least it can be as simple as furnishing the students with photographs, wonderful photographs that can get the students to tell you stories about what's going on here. My favorite is the one at the bottom with the casket, with the picture, or with the opening for the face, and students are astonished that people were buried with caskets with a window in it. Imagine that. Imagine that happening today. Whatever the case is, authentic contextualization is essential to grasping the narrative in history. I would go so far as to say that we really can't teach good Canadian history successfully without doing it. Third is student-driven learning. I would say to you that student-driven learning has been really well exemplified in the movies. Long ago, successful history teachers abandoned the model of regurgitation that has animated so many stereotypical history teachers. Whether it is the wonderful Ray Walston, who played Ace Spicoli's history teacher in Fast Times at Ridgemount High and suffered through that class, or my personal favorite, played by Ben Stein, the history teacher in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, who spent an entire period trying to convince bored students of the significance of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Imagine actually doing that. These, of course, became my personal heroes for history teaching. Whatever the case is, I do admit that all too often I have been guilty of regurgitation myself in the classroom. You do it when time is crunched, but you have to do it very sparingly. And so all across Canada today, this is being embraced by history teachers everywhere. It's called the flipped classroom. And the flipped classroom is a model that teachers have had great success with. It is to have students do much of their research work on their own time and using class time to collaborate and actually do history on their own. I like the spirit of this practice, though my flipped classroom, the one that I inhabit in my classroom, more resembles the model where my role is to establish standards and templates from which students will go off to develop their own learning and demonstrate their work in good storytelling practice. That's my flipped classroom. While a controversial figure amongst history teachers, I do think that Professor Michael Fullen has a point when he argues that historical education must shift from the teacher to the student. Indeed, this is an evolution, and it is part of a new pedagogy that we're all struggling with today. What he says is a new partnership between teachers and students that produces deeper learning outcomes. In this case, teachers switch from being the font of knowledge to a collaborative partner, which allows more one-on-one time with students. And to this end, I will begin to teach an innovative program, a 4-credit history program, which I have designed to marry 3 senior history programs with 1 senior math course on a digital platform for students, delivered in situ at the Dufferin County Museum beginning in 2015. In February of 2015, I will have 17 students from across Dufferin County bust each day to the museum to engage in deep historical research and complete 6 rich, summative historical tasks on a digital platform. The semester-long program is entitled The Digital Historian and is being entirely funded by the Upper Grand District School Board, my employer. I have to put the plug in. The museum will provide, of course, the human and archival resources, as well as 2 hours per day with professional archivists, teachers, and museum volunteers. Let me go back one. If you want to read a fuller account of this, it's going to be published in the November issue of Muse Magazine, the journal of the Canadian Museum Association. The purpose is obvious. Students will become historical storytellers and will derive much of their own learning by using a digital platform to produce historical research in Canadian history. What is particularly engaging will be the opportunity to complete a data management math program that is designed to introduce students to historical databases while teaching probability and statistical analysis. Imagine that, history and math together in one program. Who would have thunk it? We have partnered with the Archives of Ontario and the Juno Beach Centre, who will actively be involved in the progress of these digital natives as they become digital historians. We've had a highly competitive application process to attract the best students in Dufferin County to this program, as many of them quite literally in the journey have become addicted to history. And finally, making historical judgments. Let me get controversial now to close out. Making historical judgments takes students into an ethical dimension in which they are uncomfortable and in which the teacher is uncomfortable. Perhaps most important to the art of storytelling in the history classroom is this daunting proposition of challenging our students to consider an ethical dimension in all of their stories they tell about and within the Canadian narrative. All serious students of history face a delicate balance. They must retrieve and present historical information in a compelling and factual narrative, yet ultimately they can never ignore the ethics of what they've taken on. As Professor Peter Satius from UBC's Historical Thinking Project observes, taking historical perspective demands that we understand the differences between our ethical universe and those of bygone societies. We do not want to impose our own anachronistic standards on the past. At the same time, meaningful history does not treat brutal slaveholders, enthusiastic Nazis, and marauding conquistadors in a neutral manner. Historians attempt to hold back on explicit ethical judgments about actors in the midst of their accounts, but when all is said and done, if the story is meaningful, then there is an ethical judgment involved. We should expect to learn something from the past that helps us to face the ethical issues of today. In other words, what does the past teach the present? In this new digital historian program that I'm teaching, students will be challenged to make such judgments as, is it important to commemorate war memorials anymore? How do we choose what is not to be displayed in our museums? Which Canadian narrative is not worthy of being in our textbooks? Are all Canadian veterans heroes? Some of these questions are terribly poignant in light of recent events here in Ottawa. These are not simple questions, and I don't want students to shy away from them. These answers will be controversial and subject to intense debate, which is, of course, precisely the point. By making historical judgments, students will become more engaged in the telling of Canadian history. Yet such debates demand a more rigorous pedagogy from teachers and museum educators. By helping students to develop the maturity and sophistication to confront these questions, we will help them to become more historically literate Canadians and ultimately better storytellers. That's where history should be going in high schools. To close out, at one time in 1974, Pierre Burton could not ride the Toronto subway system, so perpetually bothered was he by autograph hounds and ordinary Canadians who just wanted to speak to a Canadian history luminary. Mark, I hope that happens to you on the Toronto subway all the time. That year, 1974, and I could be very wrong about this, but I think I'm right, he had 4 books on the Canadian bestseller list. I think one of them was a cookbook, but we'll put that aside. At the very least, 3 books on the Canadian bestseller list. I doubt that would happen again. As good as we are, I doubt that would happen again. Now, with the likes of Tim Cook, obviously, and Margaret Macmillan, and dozens of so many other great Canadian authors, we know that we're in good hands for now. But one hopes that George Grant will not eventually be proven to be a prophet. I think that's the concern. And of course, congratulations to Mark. It's a wonderful, wonderful honor and a great thing that Mark's been chosen. His books have become biblical to so many history teachers as they do their work in the classroom. I don't know what I'd do if I couldn't go down to the library and pull Juno off the shelves. Fortunately, I'm not the only one that does it. The kids do it too. You know, that's so important to have awards and significant recognition like that. But as I near the end of my career now in teaching, I want to leave you with this to ponder. I often challenge my students after we've been storytelling at the museum for a day. I ask them this question: who will go to the museum in the future? And of course, they're always very generous, and they always say that they will. But I am worried. Whether it is as auspicious as the Canadian War Museum, this beautiful facility in Ottawa, or whether it's as small and parochial as my Dufferin County Museum is in Shelburne, Ontario, if we in history education fail in our responsibility to create Canada's next great storytellers, then who will keep fighting for these institutions? And who will redefine our next great Canadian narrative for future generations? So I would say that I would like to see the debate begin today, but I think it already has. And I appreciate you inviting me here and being a part of this. Thanks so much.